Before Nassau became known as a pirate city, the island it stood on was quiet, underdeveloped, and largely overlooked by the major powers of Europe. New Providence Island lies in the northern Bahamas, surrounded by shallow seas and coral reefs. The land itself is low and sandy. It has no major rivers and very little fertile soil. Fresh water is limited, and farming on a large scale was difficult. For centuries, there was little reason for any empire to invest heavily in the island. What New Providence did have was a harbor. The harbor on the northeastern side of the island was deep, protected, and easy for ships to enter. Coral reefs and shallow waters made direct attacks from the open sea difficult. Ships approaching the harbor were forced to slow down and follow narrow channels. For sailors, it was a safe place to anchor and repair vessels. For a long time, that harbor remained unused. European sailors became aware of the Bahamas early in the age of exploration. In 1492, Christopher Columbus passed through the region during his first voyage to the Americas. Spanish ships followed in the decades that came after, using the islands as reference points while traveling between Europe, the Caribbean, and the mainland. Spain, however, showed little interest in settling the Bahamas. There were no known deposits of gold or silver. The islands lacked large indigenous populations that could be forced into labor. Compared to places like Hispaniola or Cuba, the Bahamas offered little economic return. Spanish ships passed through the area frequently, but permanent settlements were rare. For much of the 16th century, the islands remained sparsely populated and poorly defended. Shipwrecks were common, as vessels struck coral reefs while navigating the shallow waters. Survivors often waited days or weeks for rescue. The Bahamas developed a reputation as a dangerous place for ships, not a profitable one. English interest in the region grew slowly during the 17th century. As England expanded its colonies in North America and the Caribbean, control of shipping routes became more important. The Bahamas sat close to routes used by Spanish treasure fleets and merchant vessels. In 1670, King Charles II formally granted the Bahamas to the Lords Proprietors of Carolina. This grant gave England a legal claim over the islands, though real control remained weak. Settlers began to arrive in small numbers. On New Providence Island, a settlement known as Charlestown was established near the natural harbor. It was named after the English king and consisted mainly of wooden buildings and simple structures. Streets were unplanned, and fortifications were minimal. Life in the settlement was difficult. The soil produced little food, and most supplies had to be imported by ship. Hurricanes regularly damaged buildings and boats. Disease and shortages were common. Many settlers left after only a few years. Despite these problems, the harbor kept the settlement alive. Ships could anchor safely. Repairs could be made. Trade, though limited, was possible. Governance in Charlestown was inconsistent. Governors were appointed by England, but many lacked funding, soldiers, or authority. Some never arrived at all. The settlement received little support from the crown and was often left to manage on its own. This weakness made it vulnerable. In 1684, Spanish forces attacked the settlement. Charlestown was burned, and much of the population fled. For a time, New Providence Island was abandoned. Later, English settlers returned and rebuilt. The town was renamed Nassau, after the House of Nassau in England. The name changed, but the conditions did not. Nassau remained poor, weakly governed, and poorly defended. By the end of the 17th century, Nassau was little more than a struggling port town. It had no permanent military garrison and only basic fortifications. Its population was small and its economy unstable. At the same time, its location made it increasingly important. European powers were often at war. Ships carrying silver, gold, sugar, and other valuable cargo passed close to the Bahamas. Nassau sat near these routes, exposed and undefended. To imperial governments, this made Nassau a liability. To others, it made Nassau an opportunity. In 1701, Europe entered the War of the Spanish Succession. England and Spain were once again enemies. In the Caribbean, the war created chaos. England authorized privateers to attack enemy ships. These privateers were legally permitted to seize Spanish and French vessels. Many privateers operated out of English colonies across the region. Nassau, despite its weakness, became one of the places they passed through. Privateering brought activity to the town. Crews arrived to rest, repair ships, and sell captured goods. Nassau was never wealthy, but it survived by supporting maritime activity tied to the war. In 1714, the war ended. Treaties were signed and privateering licenses were withdrawn. Thousands of sailors suddenly found themselves without legal work. They still had ships. They still had weapons. They still knew how to take cargo by force. Some returned home. Others did not. As peace settled over Europe, Nassau stood unchanged. It was still poorly defended. It was still loosely governed. It still relied on the sea for survival. When ships began arriving in greater numbers after the war, the island was not prepared to control them. Nassau did not become a pirate city because it was strong. It became a pirate city because it was weak. And as the next years unfolded, that weakness would draw men who had no intention of leaving quietly. The settlement that would later become Nassau did not begin with pirates. It began with an attempt at ordinary colonial life. After England claimed the Bahamas in the 17th century, small groups of settlers were encouraged to establish a permanent presence on New Providence Island. The goal was straightforward. England wanted to secure its claim to the islands and limit Spanish influence in the region. In the late 1600s, settlers arrived and founded a town near the natural harbor. They named it Charlestown, after King Charles II of England. From the beginning, the settlement struggled. New Providence Island was not an easy place to live. The land was sandy and flat, with little fertile soil. There were no rivers to provide fresh water, and wells were shallow and unreliable. Farming produced very little beyond small household gardens. Most food had to be imported by ship. When supply vessels arrived late, shortages followed. When storms damaged ships, settlers went without basic goods for weeks at a time. Hurricanes regularly struck the island, tearing apart wooden buildings and docks. Disease spread easily in the heat, and medical care was limited. Life in Charlestown required constant effort simply to survive. The population remained small. Many settlers arrived with hopes of opportunity, only to leave after a few difficult seasons. Those who stayed were often tied to the sea. Some worked as fishermen. Others traded with passing ships. Many were sailors, ship repairmen, or laborers connected to maritime work. The town never developed a strong agricultural base and depended almost entirely on activity in the harbor. This dependence made the settlement vulnerable to events beyond its control. Governance in Charlestown was weak and inconsistent. Governors were appointed by English authorities, but they were often given little money and few resources. Some never arrived at all. Others stayed briefly before leaving for more stable colonies. There was no standing army and no permanent naval presence. The settlers were largely left to manage themselves. Local disputes were common. Enforcement of rules depended more on cooperation than authority. When serious problems arose, there was little anyone could do to address them. The settlement existed, but it was fragile. Despite these difficulties, the natural harbor kept Charlestown alive. Ships traveling through the Caribbean could anchor safely, repair damage, resupply with water, and rest before continuing their journeys. The harbor offered protection from storms and rough seas, and it remained useful even when the settlement itself struggled. By the end of the 17th century, England was frequently at war with Spain and France. These conflicts extended into the Caribbean, where shipping routes became targets. England authorized privateers to attack enemy ships. These privateers operated with legal permission and shared their profits with the crown. Some privateers used Charlestown as a temporary base. They brought activity, supplies, and money into the settlement. They also brought weapons and experienced sailors. Privateering blurred the line between lawful trade and violence. Armed ships became a familiar sight in the harbor. The town grew accustomed to their presence. Spain remained aware of English activity in the region and viewed settlements like Charlestown as potential threats to shipping routes. The town's location made it an easy target. In 1684, Spanish forces attacked Charlestown. The settlement was poorly defended and offered little resistance. Buildings were burned and residents fled. Some were captured. Charlestown was effectively destroyed. After the attack, New Providence Island was largely abandoned. Survivors fled to other colonies, and the settlement ceased to function. For a time, the island returned to silence. Eventually, English settlers returned and rebuilt near the same harbor. The town was renamed Nassau, in honor of the House of Nassau, connected to the English monarchy. The new name did not bring new strength. The land was still poor. Fresh water was still scarce. Supplies still depended on ships. Defenses remained minimal, and fortifications were incomplete or poorly maintained. There was still no permanent military force, and governance remained weak. By the end of the 17th century, Nassau had developed a reputation as an unstable and neglected outpost. It existed on the margins of the English Empire. The crown paid little attention to it. Merchants preferred better defended ports. Settlers often left for more stable colonies. Yet Nassau remained. It remained because of its harbor. It remained because of its location. It remained because ships continued to pass nearby. As the new century approached, Nassau was neither strong nor prosperous. It had survived destruction, abandonment, and rebuilding, but it had no clear future. It sat in a position that mattered far more than its size suggested. When war returned to Europe, and when sailors once again took to the sea with weapons and experience, Nassau would find itself drawn into events it could not control. For now, it remained a quiet and struggling town, waiting for the next phase of its history to begin. Spanish authorities had not forgotten the English presence in the Bahamas. Even though the islands themselves offered little wealth, their position along major shipping routes made them strategically important. English settlements, however small, were seen as potential threats to Spanish control of the Caribbean. By the late 17th century, Spain was actively monitoring English activity in the region. Spanish officials understood that places like Charlestown, later Nassau, could be used to shelter privateers and disrupt shipping. The settlement on New Providence Island was weak, poorly defended, and isolated, making it an easy target. In 1684, Spanish forces moved against Charlestown. The settlement had no standing army and no effective fortifications. Its defenses consisted mainly of wooden structures and small earthworks that offered little resistance to a coordinated attack. When Spanish ships arrived, the outcome was never in doubt. The attack was swift. Spanish forces landed and moved through the settlement with little opposition. Buildings were set on fire. Storehouses and docks were destroyed. Homes were burned and supplies were taken or ruined. The harbor that had kept the town alive could not protect it from an assault coming directly from the sea. The residents of Charlestown had few options. Some fled inland, seeking cover in the sparse vegetation. Others escaped by boat, leaving behind whatever they could not carry. A number of settlers were captured and taken away. The settlement ceased to function almost overnight. Charlestown was effectively erased. For a time, New Providence Island returned to silence. The harbor remained, but there was no town to support it. Wooden ruins decayed in the heat. Unfinished docks collapsed into the water. What little infrastructure had existed was gone. Survivors of the attack scattered across the Caribbean. Some traveled to other English colonies. Others found work aboard ships. Few expected to return to New Providence. For several years, the island remained largely abandoned, yet the harbor did not disappear. Ships continued to pass nearby. Sailors still knew the island offered shelter from storms and reefs that could be navigated by those familiar with the waters. Even without a settlement, New Providence remained a known point along the sea routes. Eventually, English interest returned. The decision to rebuild the settlement was not driven by optimism, but by necessity. England still claimed the Bahamas, and abandoning them entirely would leave the region open to Spanish influence. Small groups of settlers returned to New Providence Island, drawn once again by the harbor rather than the land. They rebuilt near the same location. The town was given a new name. It was now called Nassau, in honor of the House of Nassau, associated with the English monarchy. The name change signaled continuity with English authority, but it did not bring new resources or stronger defenses. Nassau remained poor. Buildings were once again constructed from wood. Streets were informal. Supplies still arrived by ship, when they arrived at all. Fresh water remained scarce. Farming produced little. The settlement depended entirely on the sea. Spanish attacks had demonstrated how vulnerable the town was, but little was done to address that vulnerability. Fortifications were planned, but rarely completed. Cannons were few and often poorly maintained. There was still no permanent military presence. Governance remained inconsistent. Governors were appointed, but many lacked funding and authority. Some stayed briefly before leaving for more secure positions elsewhere. Communication with England was slow and support was minimal. Nassau existed, but it was not secure. At the same time, the wider Caribbean was changing. European powers were frequently at war, and those wars extended across the Atlantic. Merchant ships carried valuable cargoes between the Americas and Europe. Treasure fleets passed through nearby waters. Privateering became common. Privateers were sailors, authorized by governments to attack enemy ships during wartime.
They operated legally, but their methods closely resembled piracy. They boarded vessels, seized cargo, and sold it for profit. Nassau's harbor made it useful to them. Even in its weakened state, the town offered shelter, repairs, and a place to rest. As wars continued, privateers began to use Nassau more frequently. Armed ships entered the harbor. Crews came ashore. Weapons, supplies, and goods passed through the town. This activity brought a measure of survival to Nassau, but it also introduced instability. The line between lawful privateering and unlawful piracy was thin. When wars ended, privateering licenses were withdrawn. Sailors who had made a living capturing ships were suddenly without legal protection.
By the early 18th century, Nassau had survived destruction, abandonment, and rebuilding. It remained poorly defended and weakly governed, yet it occupied a position that mattered more with each passing year. Spanish raids had shown how easily the town could be destroyed. English neglect ensured it remained vulnerable. War had introduced large numbers of experienced sailors to its harbor. All of these forces were shaping Nassau's future. The island was no longer merely a forgotten outpost. It had become a place where authority was uncertain, where armed men gathered, and where control could be taken by those willing to assert it. The stage was set for a transformation. What followed would not come from Spain or England directly, but from the men who knew the sea, the ships, and the weaknesses of the empire that claimed the island, and Nassau, once again, would change hands. After the Spanish attack and the rebuilding of the settlement, Nassau entered a long period of uneasy survival. The town existed, but it did not grow stronger. Its name had changed, yet its condition remained much the same. By the early 1700s, Nassau was once again a small port, with wooden buildings, rough docks, and little protection. The harbor was still its greatest asset, but it was also its greatest vulnerability. Ships could enter easily, and just as easily, armed men could arrive without resistance. The English government continued to claim authority over the Bahamas, but that authority was distant. Governors were appointed, but they were given few resources. Money was scarce, soldiers were scarce, and naval support was almost non-existent. Nassau was expected to govern itself with very little help. Fortifications were discussed repeatedly. Plans were drawn for defenses that could protect the harbor and the town. In practice, little was completed. Cannons were few. Walls were incomplete. Many structures fell into disrepair soon after they were built. The population remained small and unstable. Some settlers arrived, others left. Many stayed only as long as opportunity or necessity required. Permanent families were rare. Nassau was not a place where people planned far into the future. Daily life revolved around the harbor. Ships came and went. Sailors rested, repaired vessels, and waited for favorable winds. Goods were traded in small quantities. Supplies were exchanged quietly, without regulation or oversight. As European wars continued, the Caribbean filled with privateers. English, French, and Spanish ships fought across the region, often far from the direct control of their governments. Nassau became a convenient stopping point for these crews. It was close to shipping routes, lightly governed, and willing to accept anyone who arrived with goods to trade. Privateers brought money and supplies, but they also brought weapons and experience. Armed men were now a common sight in the harbor. The town adapted to their presence because it had little choice. Law enforcement was minimal. Disputes were settled informally. Authority depended on cooperation rather than force. When conflicts arose between crews, the town lacked the means to intervene. This atmosphere slowly changed the character of Nassau. It became known as a place where rules were flexible and oversight was weak. Sailors spoke of it as a port where questions were rarely asked. As the War of the Spanish Succession continued, Nassau survived by serving those who passed through it. But this survival came at a cost. The town was becoming dependent on men whose loyalty was not to the crown, but to profit. When the war eventually came to an end, the fragile balance that sustained Nassau would collapse. The sailors who had filled its harbor would no longer be protected by law, and the town would no longer be able to pretend that it was under firm control. Nassau stood once again at a turning point. It had not been destroyed, but it had not been secured. It was a place accustomed to disorder, shaped by neglect, and open to whoever arrived with ships and weapons. The next change would not come from distant governments or official decrees. It would come from the sea, carried by men who had learned to live by force and who were no longer willing to give it up. When the War of the Spanish Succession ended in 1714, the Caribbean did not become peaceful overnight. The war had lasted more than a decade, and during that time, thousands of sailors had learned to survive by attacking enemy ships. They had done so legally, under privateering commissions issued by their governments. With the signing of peace treaties, those commissions were withdrawn. For many sailors, this change came suddenly. Ships that had once sailed with legal authority were now expected to stop operating. Crews were told to disband and return to civilian life. In theory, they were meant to find work in merchant fleets or return home. In practice, many could not. These men still had ships. They still had weapons. They still knew the sea routes, the weaknesses of merchant vessels, and the habits of naval patrols. What they no longer had was protection under the law. Across the Caribbean, former privateers faced a choice. Some accepted the change and attempted to return to lawful work. Others continued to seize ships, now without permission. The difference between privateering and piracy became a matter of paperwork rather than practice. Nassau felt this change immediately. As the war ended, ships continued to arrive in its harbor. Crews came ashore, looking for supplies, repairs, and rest. Unlike other ports, Nassau did not ask many questions. There were few officials to enforce rules, and little interest in doing so. The town had grown used to accommodating armed sailors. During the war, this had been necessary for survival. After the war, it became a liability. Former privateers found Nassau useful. It was close to shipping lanes, lightly defended, and distant from strong naval authority. Captured goods could be sold quietly. Ships could be repaired without scrutiny. Crews could rest and plan their next moves. The population of Nassau began to change. More sailors stayed instead of leaving. Ships anchored longer. The harbor grew crowded with vessels whose captains no longer answered to any government. Local authority continued to weaken. Governors lacked the manpower and resources to control the growing number of armed men. Any attempt to impose strict order risked open resistance. Residents of Nassau adapted. Some profited by supplying crews. Others avoided involvement. Few challenged the presence of these men directly. By 1715, Nassau was no longer simply a neglected colonial town. It was becoming a gathering place for sailors who operated outside the law. The transition happened gradually, without a single event to mark it. there was no declaration, no formal takeover. Instead, control shifted quietly, as those with ships and weapons became the dominant force in the harbor. Nassau had not chosen this role. It had drifted into it. The town's weakness, its isolation, and its reliance on the sea had made it vulnerable to a new kind of authority. As former privateers settled in and began to act independently, Nassau moved closer to becoming something it had never been intended to be: a pirate city. In the summer of 1715, events off the coast of Florida changed the balance of power in the Caribbean. That year, a large Spanish treasure fleet was preparing to return to Europe after collecting silver, gold, and other valuables from the Americas. The fleet gathered in Havana and set sail in July, following routes that had been used for generations. Soon after leaving port, the ships encountered a powerful hurricane. The storm scattered the fleet along the Florida coast. Several vessels were driven onto reefs and sandbars. Hulls were torn open. Cargo was lost to the sea. Survivors reached shore where they could, often with little more than what they carried. The wrecks quickly became known. Spanish authorities moved to recover what they could. Salvage camps were established along the coast. Guards were posted to protect the treasure. Work began to retrieve silver and gold from the wrecked ships. News traveled fast among sailors. Former privateers and independent crews saw opportunity. They knew the region well. Many had experience working around reefs and shallow waters. They also knew that Spanish defenses were stretched thin. Small groups of sailors began moving toward the wreck sites. Some worked quietly at night. Others posed as legitimate salvagers. Silver and gold were taken in small quantities and carried away by boat. Much of this recovered treasure passed through Nassau. The town's harbor provided shelter for ships coming from Florida. Goods could be transferred, stored, or sold with little oversight. Local officials were unable or unwilling to interfere. The sudden flow of valuable cargo brought activity and wealth unlike anything Nassau had seen before. Ships stayed longer. Crews grew larger. The harbor became crowded. For many sailors, the treasure wrecks confirmed what they already believed. Operating outside the law was profitable, and Nassau was the right place to do it. The town had no effective defenses, no strong government, and no naval presence to challenge them. The population of Nassau expanded rapidly. Sailors arrived not just to pass through, but to stay. The balance of power shifted further away from colonial authorities and toward the men who controlled the ships. Local residents adjusted to the change. Some benefited from trade. Others watched quietly as the character of the town transformed. The presence of treasure increased competition and tension, but it also reinforced Nassau's role as a center for illegal activity. By the end of 1715, Nassau was no longer simply a refuge for former privateers. It had become a hub for men who lived by taking what they could from the sea. The flow of silver and gold had drawn them together, and the town's weakness allowed them to remain. What had begun as neglect had turned into opportunity. Nassau stood at the edge of open piracy, shaped not by a single decision, but by a series of events that made lawlessness both practical and profitable. The pirate city was no longer forming in theory. It was forming in practice. As more sailors settled in Nassau, the town began to change in subtle but important ways. Ships remained anchored for longer periods. Crews repaired hulls, divided cargo, and waited for information about potential targets. The harbor, once quiet, became crowded with vessels whose captains answered to no government. With this growth came the need for order. Nassau had no effective colonial authority, but complete disorder made daily life difficult even for pirates. Disputes over supplies, repairs, and stolen goods became common. Without some form of structure, the town risked turning against itself. During this period, one figure began to stand out. His name was Benjamin Hornigold. Hornigold had been a privateer during the recent war and was experienced at sea. Unlike many others, he focused his attacks almost entirely on Spanish and French ships and avoided English vessels. This approach earned him a measure of respect among other sailors, particularly those who still considered themselves loyal to England in some sense. By around 1716, Hornigold had become one of the most influential captains in Nassau. He did not rule through official title or force alone. Instead, he relied on agreement. Crews listened to him because his leadership brought stability. Under his influence, certain expectations developed within the harbor. Disputes were settled among captains. Loot was divided according to established customs. Violence within the town was discouraged. This informal order benefited everyone involved. Ships could come and go without constant conflict. Repairs could be made. Trade, both legal and illegal, continued without interruption. Nassau functioned less like a chaotic camp and more like a working port, though still outside the law. Hornigold's leadership also shaped who was welcome in the harbor. While piracy remained central to Nassau's economy, there were limits. Crews that caused unnecessary trouble or attacked English shipping risked being pushed out. This did not make Nassau lawful, but it made it predictable. Predictability mattered. Local residents found ways to coexist with the pirate population. Some supplied food, tools, and lodging. Others kept their distance. The town adjusted to the rhythm of life dictated by the harbor. During this time, Nassau began to be spoken of as a pirate stronghold, though it had no walls, no official government, and no single ruler. Its authority rested with the captains who controlled the ships and the crews who followed them. Hornigold was central among them. Under his influence, Nassau entered its most stable period as a pirate refuge. It was not peaceful in the legal sense, but it was organized enough to function. Ships arrived, rested, and departed. Information moved quietly from crew to crew. The town survived by accommodating those who lived beyond the reach of imperial law. Yet this balance was fragile. It depended on cooperation, shared interests, and the continued absence of strong external authority. As Nassau grew in importance, it also grew in visibility. Governments that had ignored it could no longer afford to do so. And within the harbor itself, new figures were arriving, men whose ambitions and methods would challenge even the loose order that Hornigold had helped create. The pirate city was entering a new phase. Around the same time that Benjamin Hornigold was establishing order in Nassau, new figures began to arrive in the harbor. Among them was a sailor whose name would later become widely known. His name was Edward Teach. Little is known about Teach's early life. Contemporary records suggest he was likely born in England, sometime in the 1680s. He may have served as a sailor or privateer during the War of the Spanish Succession, gaining experience in naval combat and the handling of ships. By the mid-1710s, he had turned to piracy. Teach arrived in Nassau around 1716 and joined Hornigold's crew. Under Hornigold's command, Teach learned how piracy operated on a larger scale. He participated in raids, observed how crews were managed,
and learned how reputation could be used as a weapon. Hornigold emphasized control and discipline, and Teach absorbed these lessons carefully. During this period, Teach began to develop the appearance that would later define him. He grew his beard long and dark. He dressed in a way that made him stand out among other sailors. These choices were deliberate. In an environment where fear could prevent resistance, appearance mattered. Hornigold eventually gave Teach command of his own vessel. With his own ship, Teach began to build a reputation quickly. He operated primarily in the Caribbean and along the American coast, targeting merchant vessels. His methods relied on intimidation rather than prolonged violence. Ships that surrendered quickly were often spared serious damage. This approach proved effective. Crews who encountered Teach reported his presence widely. Stories spread among sailors and merchants. His name began to circulate beyond Nassau. During this time, Teach came to be known by a new name, Blackbeard. In Nassau, Blackbeard was both respected and watched closely. He benefited from the order Hornigold had helped establish, but he also represented a shift. His growing fame drew attention. Each successful raid increased the visibility of the pirate city that sheltered him. Other captains took note. Some admired Blackbeard's efficiency. Others saw his reputation as a risk. The balance within Nassau depended on remaining unnoticed for as long as possible, and Blackbeard's notoriety made that difficult. Still, the harbor continued to function. Ships arrived and departed. Crews rested and repaired their vessels. Information moved quietly between captains. Nassau remained a place where pirates could operate with relative safety, but the presence of men like Blackbeard signaled a change. Piracy was no longer merely a way for former privateers to survive. It was becoming organized, profitable, and increasingly visible. The actions of a few captains now carried consequences for everyone in the harbor. As Blackbeard's reputation grew, so did the pressure on Nassau. Governments that had ignored the town began to hear its name more often. Merchants complained. Naval patrols took notice. Within the pirate city itself, ambitions were growing. The period of quiet adaptation was coming to an end. Nassau was entering a phase defined not just by survival, but by competition, fame, and the growing certainty that outside forces would soon respond. The pirate city was no longer hidden, and its most famous figures were only just beginning to shape its fate. As figures like Blackbeard rose in prominence, life inside Nassau settled into a routine shaped by the harbor. The town did not resemble a fortress or a capital. It functioned more like a working port that happened to be controlled by pirates. Each day followed a familiar pattern. Ships anchored close together in the protected waters. Crews came ashore to repair hulls, replace rigging, and take on fresh water. Sails were mended. Weapons were cleaned. Cargo was sorted and divided. The town itself adapted to serve these needs. Taverns and lodging houses operated steadily. Food was prepared in simple kitchens. Supplies were traded quietly, often without records or oversight. Payment was made in coin, goods, or promises of future profit. No single authority regulated these exchanges. Despite its reputation, Nassau was not in constant chaos. Open violence within the town was discouraged. Fights threatened business and stability, and most captains understood this. Disputes were usually settled among crews or through negotiation between leaders. Pirate customs governed behavior. Crews followed agreed rules about shares of loot, compensation for injuries, and discipline. Captains were elected
and could be removed. Decisions were often made by vote. These practices provided structure in the absence of formal law. Local residents lived alongside this system. Some benefited by selling goods and services. Others remained cautious, keeping to themselves. Few challenged pirate authority directly. The men who controlled the ships controlled the town. Nassau's harbor became a place of information as much as trade. News traveled quickly from crew to crew. Routes, patrols, and opportunities were discussed openly among those who trusted one another. Captains formed loose alliances, sharing resources when it suited them. This environment allowed piracy to function efficiently. At the same time, internal tensions grew. Not all captains shared the same priorities. Some preferred order and restraint. Others sought profit at any cost. The balance that Hornigold had helped establish depended on cooperation, and cooperation was never guaranteed. As more pirates arrived, competition increased. Supplies were limited. Harbor space grew crowded. Personal rivalries became more common. While the town continued to function, cracks began to appear beneath the surface. Outside Nassau, attention was building. Merchants complained more frequently about losses. Colonial governors reported pirate activity along major trade routes. The name of Nassau appeared more often in official correspondence. Inside the town, most pirates paid little attention to distant governments. The harbor still felt safe. Naval patrols were rare. No warships appeared on the horizon. But the conditions that allowed Nassau to thrive were becoming harder to maintain. The pirate city had grown large enough to matter. Its routines were well established, its leaders known, and its influence felt across the region. That visibility would soon bring consequences, and the fragile order that governed daily life in Nassau would be tested by both internal conflict and the return of imperial power. As Nassau grew busier, differences among pirate leaders became harder to ignore. The town depended on cooperation, but not all captains believed cooperation was necessary. Some valued order because it protected their profits. Others saw restraint as a weakness. One of the most disruptive figures during this period was Charles Vane. Vane had served as a privateer during the recent war and turned to piracy afterward. Unlike Hornigold, he had little interest in maintaining limits. He attacked ships of all nations and rejected any attempt to impose rules on his actions. By 1716, Vane had established himself as a powerful presence in Nassau. He commanded loyal crews and controlled several ships. His willingness to take risks brought profit, but it also brought danger. Merchants complained more loudly about attacks. Naval patrols increased in response. The visibility of Nassau grew. Within the harbor, tensions rose. Hornigold and other captains believed that attacking English ships threatened the fragile protection Nassau enjoyed. Vane disagreed. He argued that piracy should not be restrained by loyalty to any crown. These disagreements were not merely theoretical. They affected daily life. Crews argued over targets. Alliances shifted. Trust became harder to maintain. At the same time, pressure from outside the town continued to build. Reports of piracy reached London with increasing urgency. Merchants demanded protection. Colonial officials warned that Nassau had become a base for organized piracy rather than a neglected settlement. The British government began to discuss direct intervention. Most pirates in Nassau remained unaware of the seriousness of these discussions. The harbor still felt safe. Ships continued to arrive.
Trade and repairs continued as usual. Yet, signs of change were present. Naval patrols appeared more frequently along nearby routes. Some merchant ships traveled in convoys. Insurance rates increased. Piracy was no longer viewed as a temporary problem. Inside Nassau, the balance that had allowed the town to function began to weaken. Hornigold's influence declined as more aggressive captains gained followers. Vane's refusal to compromise attracted men who preferred confrontation over caution. The pirate city was no longer unified by shared interests. Instead, it was divided by competing visions of what piracy should be: order and restraint on one side, freedom and aggression on the other. These divisions made Nassau more dangerous, both for those who lived there and for those who controlled it. As disagreements intensified and attention from outside powers increased, the period of relative stability drew to a close. The town that had survived by remaining overlooked was now impossible to ignore. Nassau had reached the limits of what informal authority could achieve. The next stage would not be shaped by pirates alone, but by the response of an empire determined to reclaim control. By 1717, piracy in the Caribbean had reached a level that could no longer be ignored. Merchants across the Atlantic complained of losses. Insurance rates rose. Colonial governors sent reports warning that trade routes were being disrupted on a wide scale. Again and again, the same place was mentioned: Nassau. What had once been described as a weak and neglected settlement was now openly referred to as a pirate stronghold. Ships operating from its harbor were responsible for attacks stretching from the Caribbean to the American coastline. The town's name appeared regularly in letters sent to London. The British government began to take action. Rather than launching an immediate military assault, the Crown chose a different approach. King George I issued a proclamation offering a royal pardon to pirates who surrendered within a fixed period. Any pirate who accepted the pardon and ceased their activities would be forgiven for past crimes. The offer was announced in 1717. The pardon was meant to divide the pirate population. Some, it was hoped, would accept safety and legal status over continued risk. Others would be isolated and easier to pursue. News of the pardon reached Nassau quickly. Reaction within the town was mixed. Some captains viewed the offer as an opportunity to leave piracy behind. Years at sea had taken their toll, and the chance to avoid execution was appealing. Others distrusted the promise. They believed the Crown would not honor it or feared punishment once they surrendered. Benjamin Hornigold accepted the pardon. His decision marked a turning point. Hornigold had long avoided attacking English ships and had maintained a degree of order in Nassau. Accepting the pardon allowed him to keep his life and eventually serve as a pirate hunter for the British. Other pirates followed his example. Some surrendered their ships and swore loyalty to the Crown. Others quietly left Nassau, seeking refuge elsewhere. A number simply waited, unsure of what to do. Not everyone accepted the offer. Charles Vane rejected the pardon outright. He viewed surrender as weakness and refused to submit to royal authority. His decision encouraged other hardliners to continue piracy and resist any attempt at compromise. As pirates chose sides, Nassau grew more unstable. Those who accepted the pardon no longer aligned themselves with those who rejected it. Trust within the harbor declined. The informal cooperation that had once kept order weakened further. The pardon achieved its purpose.
It did not end piracy immediately, but it fractured the pirate community. Nassau was no longer unified. The town became a place of uncertainty, where no one knew which captains would remain pirates and which would soon serve the crown. This division made it easier for Britain to move to the next stage of its plan. The era in which Nassau existed without direct interference was coming to an end. The royal pardon was only the first step. Behind it lay a more decisive action, one that would soon arrive by ship. The pirate city was about to face authority in a form it had not encountered before. After the royal pardon was announced, the British government moved to enforce its authority in Nassau directly. To do this, the Crown appointed a new governor with both experience and determination. His name was Woodes Rogers. Rogers was not a career administrator. He was a former privateer who had circumnavigated the globe and understood life at sea. He knew how pirates operated, how crews were organized, and how fragile discipline could be when authority was weak. The Crown believed he was the right person to reclaim Nassau. Rogers was appointed governor of the Bahamas in 1718. He was given a difficult task. Nassau had no strong defenses, no reliable government, and a large population of armed men who had lived without law for years. Rogers was instructed to restore order, enforce the pardon, and eliminate those who refused to submit. He did not travel alone. Rogers sailed with a small fleet that included soldiers, supplies, and ships capable of enforcing his authority. His arrival was meant to demonstrate that Britain was serious about reclaiming the town. News of his appointment reached Nassau before he arrived. Pirates who had accepted the pardon prepared to cooperate. Others planned to leave. Those who rejected the pardon, including Charles Vane, prepared to resist or escape. When Rogers approached Nassau, the harbor was still crowded with pirate ships. The town had no unified response. Some captains welcomed him. Others waited cautiously. A few prepared to fight if necessary. Rogers entered the harbor without immediate resistance. His presence changed the atmosphere of the town at once. For the first time in years, Nassau faced a representative of imperial authority backed by force. Soldiers came ashore. Flags were raised. Proclamations were read. Rogers formally declared the royal pardon in effect and demanded that remaining pirates surrender or leave. Many complied. Some pirates accepted the pardon publicly. Others slipped away quietly during the night. A number of ships departed Nassau soon after Rogers' arrival, carrying crews unwilling to remain under British rule. Charles Vane chose defiance. As Rogers' forces entered the harbor, Vane set fire to one of his ships and sent it drifting toward the incoming fleet, hoping to block passage and cause damage. The attempt failed. Rogers' ships avoided the burning vessel, and Vane escaped the harbor. With Vane gone, organized resistance collapsed. Rogers took control of Nassau with limited fighting. He began rebuilding fortifications, repairing defenses, and establishing courts. The period of pirate rule ended, not with a great battle, but with a steady reassertion of authority. The pirate city did not fall in a single moment. It faded. The arrival of Woodes Rogers marked the beginning of the end for Nassau as a pirate stronghold. What followed would be a gradual process of pursuit, punishment, and decline, as those who refused the pardon were hunted down one by one. The era of open piracy in Nassau was ending, but its most famous figures had not yet disappeared. With Nassau now under British control, Piracy did not end immediately. Many pirates had accepted the royal pardon, but others chose to continue operating elsewhere. Among the most notable of these was Edward Teach, known as Blackbeard. After leaving Nassau, Blackbeard sailed north along the American coast. In early 1718, he operated near the Carolinas, where shipping traffic was heavy and naval patrols were limited. His presence was reported frequently, and merchants grew increasingly concerned. Blackbeard commanded a powerful ship, often identified as the Queen Anne's Revenge. It carried numerous guns and a large crew, making it an intimidating sight. Rather than relying on constant violence, Blackbeard used fear to his advantage. Ships that encountered him often surrendered without resistance. In May 1718, Blackbeard blockaded the port of Charleston, South Carolina. For several days, ships entering or leaving the harbor were stopped and searched. Blackbeard demanded supplies, including medicine, rather than gold. Once his demands were met, he allowed the port to resume normal activity. The blockade drew attention from colonial authorities. Governors along the coast began coordinating efforts to stop him. Virginia's governor, Alexander Spotswood, took particular interest. He authorized a naval expedition to hunt Blackbeard, even though the pirate was operating outside Virginia's direct jurisdiction. Lieutenant Robert Maynard of the Royal Navy was given command of the mission. In November 1718, Maynard tracked Blackbeard to Ocracoke Inlet off the coast of North Carolina. Blackbeard was anchored there with a reduced crew. At dawn, Maynard's ships entered the inlet. The battle was brief but intense. Blackbeard resisted fiercely, but he was eventually overwhelmed. He was killed in close combat. His body was thrown overboard, and his head was taken as proof of his death. The news spread quickly. Blackbeard's death marked a turning point. He had become the most recognizable pirate of his time, and his defeat demonstrated that the era of tolerance for piracy was ending. Naval patrols increased. Governors were encouraged to pursue remaining pirates more aggressively. In Nassau, Woodes Rogers continued rebuilding the town. Fortifications were strengthened. Courts were established. Order returned slowly. Former pirates who had accepted the pardon were monitored closely. Some settled into ordinary lives. Others left the region altogether. The harbor grew quieter as pirate ships disappeared. Piracy did not vanish overnight, but its center shifted away from Nassau. The town that had once sheltered hundreds of pirates was now firmly under British control. The pirate city had lost its most famous figure, and with him, much of its power and influence. What remained was a memory of a brief period when authority had faded and men had ruled by force and agreement rather than law. That period was coming to an end. After the death of Blackbeard, the decline of piracy accelerated across the Caribbean. His execution had been public and deliberate, intended to send a clear message. The British government wanted pirates to understand that the period of tolerance was over. Other pirate leaders soon faced similar pressure. Charles Vane, who had rejected the royal pardon and fled Nassau, continued to operate for a time. He attacked shipping aggressively and refused to compromise. But his refusal to cooperate with other captains left him isolated. His crew eventually abandoned him, leaving him stranded after a shipwreck. Vane was captured in 1719. He was taken to Jamaica, where he was tried for piracy. The trial was brief. Evidence was clear, and there was little sympathy for him. Vane was convicted and executed later that year. His death removed one of the last prominent figures who had openly resisted British authority. Other pirates met similar ends. Some were captured and executed. Others were killed in encounters with naval patrols. A number accepted pardons late, hoping to avoid punishment. A few managed to disappear quietly, blending into colonial society, or leaving the region altogether. These outcomes were not accidental. Naval patrols increased steadily after 1718. Warships were assigned to key routes. Colonial governors were given greater authority to pursue pirates. Cooperation between colonies improved, making it harder for pirates to escape by moving from one jurisdiction to another. Safe harbors disappeared. Ports that had once tolerated piracy tightened their controls. Supplies became harder to obtain. Information was no longer shared freely. Crews found it increasingly difficult to repair ships or sell captured goods without being reported. Nassau, under Woodes Rogers, played a role in this change. Rogers continued strengthening defenses and enforcing the law. Former pirates who had accepted the pardon were kept under observation. Any sign of renewed piracy was dealt with quickly. The harbor no longer offered protection to those operating outside the law. As piracy declined, Nassau changed again. Trade resumed under regulation. Merchants returned cautiously. The town began to resemble an ordinary colonial port rather than a pirate refuge. Life became quieter and more predictable. The period when Nassau had served as the center of Caribbean piracy was brief, lasting only a few years. Yet, its impact had been widespread. Pirates operating from its harbor had disrupted trade across vast distances and forced governments to respond. By the early 1720s, the pirate city no longer existed in practice. What remained were stories, court records, and the memories of those who had lived through the period. The men who had once controlled the harbor were gone, replaced by officials, soldiers, and merchants. Nassau had survived yet another transformation. This time, the change was permanent. The era of the pirate city had passed into history. With piracy in decline, Nassau entered a period of adjustment. The sudden absence of pirate crews left gaps in the town's economy and daily life. Taverns were quieter. Docks were less crowded. Ships came and went on regular schedules rather than in clusters. Woodes Rogers focused on rebuilding Nassau as a functioning colonial town. Fortifications were repaired and expanded. New defenses were placed to protect the harbor more effectively. Soldiers were stationed permanently, and patrols were organized to discourage any return of pirate activity. For the first time in many years, authority in Nassau was visible and consistent. Courts were established to enforce British law. Disputes that had once been settled informally were now handled through legal processes. This shift was gradual, but it changed the rhythm of daily life. Residents adjusted to rules that had not existed during the pirate period. Former pirates who had accepted the royal pardon faced difficult choices. Some attempted to settle as fishermen, laborers, or traders. Others struggled to adapt to life without the profits and freedom piracy had provided. A number left Nassau entirely, seeking opportunities elsewhere. Rogers faced resistance at times, not from pirates, but from settlers, frustrated by shortages and strict enforcement. Rebuilding a town that had relied on illegal trade was not easy. Supplies were limited, and hurricanes continued to damage infrastructure. Despite these challenges, Nassau stabilized. merchants returned slowly, encouraged by the presence of defenses and the reduction of piracy. Trade resumed under regulation. Ships carrying legal cargo began using the harbor more regularly. The town's reputation improved over time. Nassau no longer attracted attention as a lawless port. Instead, it became known as a small but secure colonial settlement. Its strategic location remained important, but it was now controlled rather than exploited. The pirate period was already beginning to fade from daily memory. New arrivals heard stories of the past, but they encountered a town shaped by order rather than defiance. The harbor that had once sheltered hundreds of pirates now served ordinary commerce. Nassau had changed again. It had survived neglect, destruction, piracy, and reclamation. Each phase had left marks on the town and its people. By the early 1720s, Nassau had settled into a quieter existence. The pirate city was gone. What remained was a place that had briefly stood outside imperial control, only to be drawn back in by force and necessity. Its story would continue, but never again in the same way. As Nassau settled into its new role under British rule, the memory of piracy began to change. What had once been a daily reality became a subject of conversation and reflection. Stories were told in taverns and homes, often shaped by distance and time rather than accuracy. Former pirates who had survived the transition followed different paths. Some remained in the Bahamas, living quietly under observation. They worked as fishermen, sailors, or laborers, avoiding attention. Others left the region entirely, moving to North America or returning to Europe. A few disappeared from records altogether. Not all former pirates succeeded in adjusting. Life under law was restrictive compared to the freedom they had known. Wages were low. Discipline was enforced. The sense of independence that had defined their earlier lives was gone. For local residents, the changes were mixed. The return of order brought safety and stability, but it also brought regulation and control. Trade was now taxed and monitored. Activities that had once been tolerated were now punished. Nassau's economy shifted slowly. Legal commerce replaced the informal exchanges of the pirate era. Merchants rebuilt connections with other ports. Supplies became more predictable, though still vulnerable to storms and delays. The town's population became more settled. Families began to stay longer. Buildings were repaired with greater care. Streets became more permanent. The harbor continued to define life in Nassau, but its role had changed. Naval patrols remained active throughout the region. The presence of warships discouraged any return of large-scale piracy. Isolated attacks still occurred elsewhere, but Nassau was no longer involved. Over time, the pirate period took on a different character in memory. It was remembered not as a time of constant danger, but as a brief interruption between phases of colonial control. The reality had been harsher and less romantic than later stories suggested. For officials, Nassau served as an example. It demonstrated what could happen when authority weakened and how quickly order could be lost. It also showed how control could be restored through persistence and force. By the mid-1720s, the town had fully moved beyond its pirate past. New generations grew up hearing about pirates as figures of history rather than neighbors or threats. The harbor remained busy, but its purpose was ordinary. Nassau continued, shaped by its location and its past, but no longer defined by piracy. The city that had briefly stood outside imperial control had been absorbed again.
leaving behind lessons that would be remembered long after the men who ruled it were gone.
After the pirate era ended, Nassau entered a long and quiet period of adjustment. The change did not happen suddenly, and it was not dramatic. Instead, it unfolded over years, shaped by routine, administration, and gradual rebuilding. The harbor that had once been filled with pirate ships became quieter, and the town slowly shifted toward a more ordinary existence. Woodes Rogers remained governor during these early years, and his task was not an easy one. Nassau had been shaped by neglect, lawlessness, and dependency on piracy. Rebuilding it into a functioning colonial settlement required more than fortifications and patrols. It required reshaping habits, expectations, and daily life. The town's economy had to change first. During the pirate period, Nassau had relied heavily on illegal trade. Goods arrived without records. Supplies were exchanged informally. Payment often came in stolen cargo rather than coin. Once piracy ended, the system collapsed. Legal merchants were cautious about returning, unsure whether order would last. At first, trade was slow. Ships arrived less frequently, and when they did, they followed rules that had not existed before. Cargo was inspected. Duties were collected. Disputes were handled by courts rather than negotiation or force. For many residents, this adjustment was difficult. What had once been flexible was now regulated. Some residents struggled to adapt. Taverns that had thrived during the pirate years saw fewer customers. Lodging houses stood partially empty. Dock workers found less work, as ships stayed for shorter periods and departed more quickly. Others found new opportunities. Merchants who had avoided Nassau during its pirate phase began to consider it again. The presence of fortifications and soldiers provided reassurance. Slowly, legitimate trade routes reopened. Goods moved through the harbor with greater predictability. The harbor remained central to life in Nassau, but its rhythm changed. Instead of sudden arrivals and departures, ships followed schedules tied to commerce rather than raids. Repairs were planned, supplies were stocked in advance. The unpredictability that had once defined the port faded. Daily life became quieter. Residents woke to the sound of ordinary work rather than shouted orders or celebrations of captured ships. Streets were less crowded. Nights were calmer. The constant presence of armed crews was gone. For former pirates who had accepted the royal pardon, life was particularly challenging. Many had spent years living by their own rules. They were accustomed to sharing loot, voting on decisions, and choosing their leaders. Under British rule, these practices had no place. Authority came from officials rather than agreement. Some former pirates adapted successfully. They used their knowledge of the sea to work as fishermen, sailors, or guides. Others found employment repairing ships or loading cargo. A few used whatever savings they had managed to keep to start small businesses. But many struggled. Wages were low. Discipline was strict. The excitement and profit of piracy were gone. Some grew restless. Others left Nassau entirely, seeking anonymity in larger colonies or returning to Europe. Records from this period are incomplete, but it is clear that many former pirates simply vanished from history. They blended into ordinary populations, leaving behind the identities that had once made them feared. Nassau itself continued to rebuild slowly. Fortifications were strengthened further, though progress was often interrupted by storms and shortages. Hurricanes remained a constant threat, damaging buildings and ships with little warning. Each storm forced the town to repair and rebuild once again. Despite these setbacks, progress continued. Courts became more established. Officials handled disputes over property, contracts, and trade. Law replaced custom, and written records replaced verbal agreements. Over time, this created stability, even if it reduced flexibility. Families began to settle more permanently. Homes were repaired with greater care. Some buildings were rebuilt using stronger materials. Streets became more defined, though still far from orderly. The town's population stabilized. Nassau would never become a major city, but it no longer hovered on the edge of collapse. Its survival no longer depended on piracy or neglect, but on trade, administration, and imperial support. Beyond Nassau, the Caribbean also changed. Naval patrols remained active throughout the region. Britain, Spain, and France invested more heavily in protecting shipping routes. Cooperation between colonies improved. Pirates found it increasingly difficult to operate openly. The Caribbean that had allowed piracy to flourish was becoming less forgiving. This shift did not eliminate piracy entirely. Isolated attacks continued for years, but the large pirate communities that had once existed, like Nassau, no longer formed. Without safe harbors, piracy became dangerous and unsustainable. As time passed, the pirate era began to take on a different character in memory. Stories were told and retold, often exaggerating freedom, wealth, and rebellion. The reality had been harsher. Pirate life involved danger, uncertainty, and short careers. Most pirates did not grow rich or live long lives. In Nassau, older residents remembered the pirate years not as a golden age, but as a time of instability. They remembered shortages, fear, and uncertainty, alongside moments of opportunity. For them, the return of order was a relief, even if it came with restrictions. Younger generations heard these stories differently. For those who grew up after piracy had ended, pirates became figures of the past. They were part of local history rather than daily life. Names like Blackbeard and Hornigold were spoken with curiosity rather than concern. Over time, written accounts and popular stories reshaped these memories further. Pirates became symbols of defiance and independence. The conditions that had created piracy were often overlooked. Nassau's role in this transformation was significant. The town had existed at the intersection of neglect and opportunity. Its weakness had allowed pirates to take control, and its location had made it valuable. When authority returned, Nassau demonstrated how quickly such communities could be dismantled. Officials in Britain and the colonies studied Nassau's experience. It informed future decisions about colonial governance, naval patrols, and trade protection. The lesson was clear. Weak authority created space for lawlessness. Strong, consistent enforcement could remove it. Nassau became a cautionary example rather than a model. As the years passed, the town continued its quiet existence. Trade continued at a modest level. The harbor served ordinary purposes. Life followed predictable patterns shaped by seasons, storms, and schedules. The pirate city existed now only in memory. Its rise had been rapid. Its fall had been quieter, marked by administration rather than battle. The transformation left traces in records, ruins, and stories, but not in the daily structure of the town. Nassau remained where it had always been, on a low, sandy island beside a protected harbor. The land had not changed. The sea had not changed. What had changed was who controlled them. The period when pirates ruled Nassau was brief, lasting only a few years, yet its impact extended far beyond that time. It influenced trade, policy, and imagination across the Atlantic world. In the end, Nassau did not become famous because it was powerful or wealthy. It became famous because it revealed how quickly order could disappear and how slowly it returned. The town endured, shaped by forces larger than itself. And as it settled into the long decades that followed, the pirate era faded into history, leaving behind a quieter place that carried the memory of a time when authority had vanished and the sea had decided who ruled the shore. As the pirate era faded further into the past, the way it was remembered began to change. In Nassau and across the Atlantic world, piracy slowly moved from lived experience into story. This shift happened gradually, shaped by distance, time, and repetition. During the years when pirates had controlled Nassau, their presence had been practical rather than romantic. They repaired ships, argued over supplies, worried about patrols, and struggled with shortages. Their lives were uncertain, often short, and rarely comfortable. Yet, as those years passed, memory softened the details. Stories began to emphasize daring and independence rather than hardship. The violence, disease, and fear that had accompanied piracy were mentioned less often. What remained were simplified accounts of freedom and rebellion. This transformation was not unique to Nassau. Across Europe and the American colonies, piracy became a subject of fascination. Pamphlets, books, and later plays presented pirates as larger-than-life figures. These accounts often drew loosely from real events, but altered them to suit audiences. Nassau's brief role as a pirate city made it a central setting for many of these stories. Names like Blackbeard and Charles Vane became symbols rather than individuals. Their actions were condensed into dramatic moments. The complexity of their choices and the conditions that shaped them were largely ignored. For historians and officials, however, the memory of Nassau remained more practical. British authorities viewed the pirate period as a warning. Reports and correspondence from the early 18th century emphasized the dangers of weak governance and neglected colonies. Nassau was cited as an example of what could happen when authority was absent for too long. These lessons influenced later colonial policy. Greater attention was paid to fortifications, naval patrols, and administrative oversight. While piracy did not disappear entirely, it was less able to establish lasting strongholds. In Nassau itself, physical traces of the pirate era slowly vanished. Wooden structures were replaced or repaired. Docks were rebuilt. Ruins left from earlier destruction faded under new construction. The harbor continued to serve its purpose, but its appearance changed with time. Older residents remembered the pirate years as a disruption rather than a golden age. They remembered shortages, uncertainty, and fear alongside moments of opportunity. For them, stability was preferable, even if it meant stricter rules and fewer chances for profit. Younger generation grew up hearing about pirates as figures of the past. For them, piracy was history rather than memory. Stories passed down through families were mixed with popular accounts, making it difficult to separate fact from exaggeration. Nassau settled fully into its role as an ordinary colonial town. Its importance lay in its location, not its power. Ships continued to pass through. Trade continued at a modest scale. Life followed predictable patterns shaped by weather, seasons, and schedules. The pirate city existed now only as an idea. It had lasted for a short time, born out of neglect, war, and opportunity. It ended when those conditions changed. Authority returned, and piracy lost the space it needed to thrive. Nassau remained. Its history included pirates, but it was not defined by them alone. The island had existed before piracy, and it continued long after. The sea still surrounded it. The harbor still offered shelter. The rhythms of daily life endured. What had changed was the story people told about it, and that story would continue to evolve, shaped not by events themselves, but by how they were remembered. As the 18th century progressed, Nassau settled further into its role as an ordinary colonial town, but the shadow of its pirate past never fully disappeared. The harbor remained the same, the land unchanged, yet the meaning attached to both had shifted. What had once been a place of opportunity for men living outside the law was now a regulated port governed by imperial rules. This transition did not erase the effects of the pirate years. Instead, it layered new routines over old foundations. Trade continued to shape daily life. Ships arrived carrying goods from Britain, North America, and other Caribbean ports. Cargo was unloaded methodically. Manifests were checked. Duties were collected. The harbor, once crowded with ships flying no national flags, now displayed clear markings of ownership and allegiance. This order brought predictability. Merchants knew when ships would arrive. Residents could plan around supply schedules. Prices stabilized compared to the erratic fluctuations of the pirate period. Though Nassau never became wealthy, it became reliable. Reliability mattered. Families began to settle with greater confidence. Homes were repaired more carefully. Some structures were rebuilt using sturdier materials, though wood remained common. Streets became more defined, shaped by repeated use rather than design. The town grew slowly, not in size, but in permanence. Life followed familiar rhythms. Mornings began early to take advantage of daylight and cooler temperatures. Work centered around the harbor, warehouses, and small workshops. Fishing remained important. So did ship maintenance. Afternoons slowed as heat increased. Evenings were quieter, shaped by routine rather than celebration. The constant tension that had once accompanied pirate life was gone. For those who had lived through the pirate years, this calm felt unfamiliar at first. Some missed the sense of opportunity, however dangerous it had been. Others welcomed the absence of fear and uncertainty. Over time, the new normal replaced the old. Former pirates who had remained in Nassau became increasingly difficult to identify. Years passed. Hair grayed. Faces changed. Those who had once commanded ships now worked ordinary jobs. Their pasts were known to some, but rarely spoken of openly. Silence served a purpose. Colonial authorities preferred stability over confrontation. As long as former pirates followed the law, there was little interest in revisiting old crimes. The priority was preventing piracy from returning, not punishing those who had already abandoned it. This approach allowed Nassau to move forward. Beyond the town, the Caribbean underwent similar changes. Naval patrols became a permanent presence, rather than a temporary response. Empires invested more heavily in protecting trade routes. Communication between colonies improved, making it harder for criminal networks to operate undetected. Piracy did not vanish completely, but it lost the conditions it needed to flourish. Without safe harbors, pirates were forced to operate alone or in small groups. This made them easier to track and capture. The era of large pirate communities was over. As this reality settled in, attention turned increasingly to the past.
Writers, publishers, and entertainers found piracy to be a compelling subject. Stories of rebellion, danger, and freedom captured imaginations. These accounts often borrowed names and events from history, but reshaped them for dramatic effect. In these stories, pirates were portrayed as bold individuals resisting authority rather than as men responding to economic pressure, war, and neglect. Nassau became a symbol of absolute freedom, unburdened by law. The reality had been far more constrained. Pirates in Nassau had depended on the harbor, on supplies from residents, and on the absence of naval patrols. Their freedom existed within narrow limits. When those limits closed, piracy collapsed. Yet stories rarely dwell on limitations. Over time, these simplified accounts spread widely. They reached audiences far removed from the Caribbean and from the early 18th century. For many, piracy became a romanticized chapter of history rather than a complex social phenomenon. This transformation shaped how Nassau was remembered. In official records, the town appeared as a problem that had been solved. Reports focused on governance, trade, and security. In popular culture, Nassau appeared as a place of adventure and defiance. Both perspectives existed side by side. For historians, reconciling these views required careful examination of primary sources. Letters, court transcripts, shipping records, and government correspondence revealed a town constantly negotiating survival. They showed residents adapting to shifting power, pirates arguing over resources, and officials struggling with limited means. These records painted a quieter, harsher picture than legend suggested.
They showed that piracy had not been sustainable. It thrived briefly because circumstances allowed it, not because it represented a viable alternative to imperial rule. Nassau's experience reinforced this conclusion. The town had not been transformed by a grand rebellion or ideological movement. It had been shaped by neglect, geography, and war. When those conditions changed, the pirate city dissolved without dramatic collapse. This understanding influenced later historical thinking. Rather than viewing piracy as a romantic anomaly, scholars began to see it as part of broader patterns. Piracy emerged where authority weakened and disappeared where authority returned. Nassau was one example among many, but it was particularly well documented. As decades passed, physical traces of the pirate era continued to fade. Wooden structures were replaced or repaired. Docks were rebuilt. Storms erased remnants of earlier construction. The landscape returned to a more ordinary appearance. Memory became the primary link to the past. Oral histories persisted for a time. Older residents shared stories with younger generations. These stories varied in tone, some cautionary, others nostalgic. Over time, even these accounts blended with popular narratives. Eventually, few could distinguish between first-hand memory and later embellishment. By the latter half of the 18th century, Nassau's pirate past had become a distant chapter. The town's identity rested more on its role as a colonial port than on its brief period of lawlessness. Yet, the fascination remained. Piracy offered a way to explore themes of power, freedom, and control. Nassau's story provided a concrete example of how those themes played out in a specific place and time. The pirate city had existed for only a few years, but its influence extended far beyond that span. It affected trade policy, naval strategy, and cultural imagination. It demonstrated both the fragility of order and the resilience of authority. As history moved forward, Nassau continued to change. Empires rose and fell. Trade routes shifted. New conflicts emerged. Through it all, the island remained, shaped by forces larger than any group that temporarily controlled it. The harbor still offered shelter. The sea still dictated movement. Life continued. The pirate era became one layer among many. It was neither the beginning nor the end of Nassau's story, but a moment that revealed how quickly power could shift when conditions aligned. And as time passed, that moment grew quieter, settling into history, not as an explosion, but as an echo. As Nassau moved further away from its pirate years, its story began to take on a different role. It was no longer simply a place that had experienced piracy. It became an example used by officials, writers, and administrators to explain how piracy emerged and how it could be prevented. In the decades following the collapse of the pirate city, British authorities often referred back to Nassau when discussing colonial governance. Reports emphasized that piracy had not appeared because pirates were unusually powerful, but because control had been weak. Nassau had been neglected for years, left without strong defenses, reliable leadership, or consistent oversight. When pirates arrived, they encountered little resistance. This understanding shaped policy across the Caribbean. Governors were instructed to maintain stronger garrisons. Naval patrols became permanent rather than temporary. Ports were monitored more closely. Trade was regulated with greater attention to documentation and enforcement. The goal was not simply to punish pirates, but to prevent the conditions that allowed them to thrive. Nassau demonstrated that piracy could not exist without support, even indirect support. Pirates needed food, water, repairs, and places to sell goods. When these were denied or controlled, piracy became far more difficult. This lesson influenced decisions far beyond the Bahamas. Other colonies that showed signs of neglect were reviewed more carefully. Fortifications were repaired. Officials were reminded of their responsibilities. While these measures did not eliminate all crime, they reduced the likelihood of large pirate communities forming again. At the same time, Nassau's story spread beyond administrative circles. Writers and readers in Britain and the American colonies became increasingly interested in tales of piracy. Some accounts claimed to be factual histories, while others blended truth with invention. Nassau appeared frequently in these works, often portrayed as a place of unchecked freedom. These portrayals rarely reflected the realities recorded in official documents. Pirate life in Nassau had been constrained by geography, resources, and constant risk. Food shortages were common. Storms damaged ships. Disease spread quickly. Profits were uncertain. Violence, when it occurred, carried lasting consequences. Yet, stories favored simplicity. They focused on defiance rather than dependence, on freedom rather than vulnerability. Nassau became a symbol rather than a settlement, its complexities flattened into a single image. This process changed how piracy itself was understood. Instead of being seen as a response to economic pressure and war, piracy was recast as a deliberate rejection of authority. Pirates became characters rather than people shaped by circumstance. For historians, this shift presented challenges. Separating myth from reality required careful attention to primary sources. Court records revealed harsh punishments. Letters described fear and instability. Shipping logs showed how quickly piracy disrupted trade. Together, these sources painted a picture far removed from popular legend. Nassau's experience was particularly valuable in this regard because it was so well documented. The town's rise and fall as a pirate center occurred over a short period and involved figures who left clear traces in the record. This clarity made it easier to understand how quickly piracy could appear and how quickly it could disappear when conditions changed. As years passed, the physical town continued to evolve. Buildings were repaired and replaced. New generations reshaped the landscape according to their needs. The harbor remained central, but its use was fully integrated into legal trade networks. Visitors arriving in Nassau later in the 18th century encountered a town that bore little resemblance to its pirate past. Few visible signs remained. What persisted was reputation rather than reality. The pirate city existed primarily in memory. For some, that memory was a source of pride or fascination. For others, it was a reminder of instability. For officials, it was a lesson in governance. All of these perspectives coexisted. Nassau's story showed that history does not remain fixed. It changes as it is retold, interpreted, and adapted. Events that once caused fear can later become entertainment. Places that once struggled can later be remembered for a single dramatic phase. Yet, beneath these changing interpretations, the underlying facts remained. Nassau had been shaped by neglect. Pirates had filled the gap left by absent authority. When authority returned and remained consistent, piracy ended. This pattern was not unique to Nassau, but Nassau made it visible. As the 18th century continued, the pirate era receded further into the past. Its influence persisted in policy, culture, and imagination, but its direct impact faded. What remained was a quieter town, continuing its existence beside the same harbor, shaped by forces that had little interest in legend. The pirate city had passed into history, and history, once written, would continue to reshape it. As the pirate era moved further into the past, its influence lingered less in daily life and more in the way people understood power and authority. Nassau's experience became part of a broader understanding of how control was maintained across distant territories. Empires learned that distance created vulnerability. The Bahamas had been neglected not because they were unimportant, but because they seemed unprofitable and quiet. That neglect allowed a small settlement to become a center of piracy. Once this lesson was absorbed, imperial powers adjusted their priorities. Nassau did not become wealthy or powerful afterward, but it remained watched. Governors were expected to report regularly. Naval patrols continued to pass through the region. Fortifications were maintained even when they seemed unnecessary. The memory of piracy justified their presence. For residents, this constant oversight became part of normal life. Authority was no longer absent, but it was not always intrusive. Most days passed quietly. Trade followed predictable patterns. Disputes were handled through established processes. The town existed within the boundaries set for it. The sense of possibility that had once drawn pirates to Nassau faded. Opportunities for sudden wealth no longer appeared. Risk outweighed reward. The harbor offered shelter, not escape. As generations passed, few remembered the pirate years firsthand. Knowledge of that period came through stories, books, and occasional references in official records. The events felt distant, belonging to another time. Yet, fascination endured. Piracy offered a way to imagine, freedom from constraint. It appealed to readers and listeners far removed from the realities of colonial life. Stories emphasized independence and rebellion,
often ignoring the conditions that had made piracy short-lived and unsustainable. Nassau became part of this imagined world. Its name was used to evoke lawlessness and adventure, even as the real town lived a quiet existence. This contrast grew wider with time. For historians, Nassau remained important because it showed how myth could grow from ordinary circumstances. The pirate city had not been extraordinary because pirates were exceptional, but because conditions allowed them to gather in one place. When those conditions ended, so did the pirate city. This understanding influenced how later periods of disorder were interpreted. Scholars and officials alike recognized that instability often arose not from rebellion alone, but from neglect and imbalance. Nassau's story reinforced the idea that authority, once withdrawn, could not be easily replaced without effort. As the 19th century approached, the Caribbean changed again. Trade routes shifted. New economic systems developed. The era that had given rise to piracy was far behind. Nassau continued to exist, shaped by its geography rather than its past. The harbor remained useful. The island remained limited in resources. Life continued quietly. The pirate era became one chapter among many. It was remembered selectively, interpreted repeatedly, and adapted to new purposes. But its reality remained fixed in the records left behind. Those records told a story of survival, adaptation, and change. They showed that piracy was not a permanent alternative to authority, but a temporary response to its absence. Nassau's brief transformation illustrated this clearly. As time passed, even the memory of piracy softened. It became less about danger and more about curiosity, less about disruption and more about narrative. The town that had once stood outside imperial control now stood fully within history, its past reshaped by distance and reflection. The pirate city was gone. What remained was understanding, and that understanding continued to influence how the past was remembered, long after the ships had left the harbor and the men who once ruled it had faded into history.
As time continued to pass, it became clear that the pirate era could never have lasted for long. Nassau's brief transformation was not the result of a stable system, but of a temporary imbalance. Once that imbalance was corrected, piracy faded naturally. Piracy depended on very specific conditions. There had to be war to produce experienced sailors without work. There had to be valuable trade routes nearby. There had to be places where authority was weak or absent. Nassau met all of these conditions for a short time, and when those conditions changed, piracy lost its foundation. When wars ended, privateering commissions disappeared. When naval patrols increased, movement became risky. When governors returned and remained in place, safe harbors vanished. Each of these changes narrowed the space in which pirates could operate. Without safe ports, piracy became exhausting. Ships needed constant maintenance. Crews needed food, water, and rest. Injuries and illness were common. Without reliable places to resupply and repair, even successful pirates struggled to continue. Nassau had once provided these necessities. Once it no longer did, piracy became unsustainable. This reality was reflected in the short lives of most pirates. Few remained active for more than a few years. Many were captured or killed. Others surrendered or disappeared into ordinary life. The idea of pirates living long careers of freedom did not match historical evidence. Nassau's experience showed that piracy was not a parallel society capable of lasting indefinitely. It was a temporary response to disorder. When order returned, piracy collapsed. This understanding also explained why piracy reappeared only in specific moments of history. It flared up during periods of war, economic disruption, or weak governance, then faded when those conditions improved. Nassau was one of the clearest examples of this pattern. As this perspective became more widely accepted, piracy was viewed less as a romantic rebellion and more as a symptom. It reflected instability rather than independence. For Nassau, this meant that its pirate years were always destined to be brief. The town did not fail as a pirate city because pirates were defeated in a single moment. It failed because the conditions that sustained piracy no longer existed. Authority returned, trade stabilized, and oversight became consistent. The harbor continued to function, but within limits. Ships still came and went. Goods were still exchanged. Life still followed the rhythms set by the sea. What had changed was who controlled those rhythms. As decades passed, Nassau blended fully into the wider colonial world. Its pirate past became one chapter among many, referenced occasionally, but rarely felt directly. The town's future was shaped by ordinary concerns rather than extraordinary events. The pirate era remained compelling because it was brief. It stood out against the longer stretches of routine that surrounded it. That contrast made it memorable, even as its realities faded. History often preserves moments of disruption more clearly than periods of stability. Nassau's pirate years were one such moment. They were intense, visible, and unusual, but they were not representative of the town's longer existence. In the end, Nassau endured because it adapted. It survived neglect, piracy, and reclamation by adjusting to changing circumstances. Its strength lay not in rebellion or authority, but in persistence. The pirate city passed, but the town remained. And as history continued to move forward, Nassau's brief encounter with piracy settled into the past, remembered not for what it promised, but for what it revealed about power, absence, and the limits of disorder. As the pirate era settled fully into history, what remained was not chaos or legend, but quiet continuity. Nassau continued to exist, much as it always had, shaped by geography, trade, and the steady movement of ships through its harbor. The island itself had never changed. The land remained sandy and flat. Fresh water was still limited. Storms still arrived without warning. These conditions had existed long before pirates came, and they continued long after pirates were gone. What changed was how the island was governed. Authority was no longer distant or uncertain. Governors came and stayed. Laws were enforced with regularity. Naval patrols passed through on predictable routes. The absence that had once allowed pirates to gather no longer existed. For the people living in Nassau, this meant a return to routine. Daily life was defined by work rather than opportunity. Fishermen set out early. Dock workers loaded and unloaded cargo. Merchants tracked supplies and schedules. Evenings were quiet. Nights passed without alarm. The harbor no longer belonged to those willing to take it. It belonged to those authorized to use it. As years passed, the pirate period became increasingly abstract. It was something that had happened, not something that shaped daily decisions. Children grew up hearing stories that sounded distant and unreal. Adults focused on ordinary concerns, such as weather, trade, and family. Memory softened, details blurred, names remained, but circumstances faded. What had once been driven by necessity and risk became simplified into narrative. This is how history often changes. Moments of disorder become stories of freedom. Periods of hardship become tales of adventure. Nassau's pirate years followed this pattern, shaped more by retelling than by record. Yet, the records remained. Letters, court documents, and official reports preserved